Well, from the 1st of October, our international borders will reopen slowly and cautiously, but it is happening. We still have to compile a list of countries that have the green light to visit us, and in turn, we need to see which countries will welcome South African tourists. There is much to learn from the experience of other countries. Let's talk now to our correspondents in London, Olly, Barratt and Simon Marks in Washington. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. Olly, I'll start with you. Is South Africa on the United Kingdom's fly list yet?
Not yet, but the fly list changes regularly. In fact, we've just had today's changes. For example, the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps announcing that Singapore and Thailand are being added to the list of countries from which you can arrive in the UK and not have to quarantine. He's also announced, by the way, that a couple of countries have been taken off, Slovenia and Guadeloupe. South Africa is not currently on the list of those travel corridors, but that doesn't mean that South Africans wouldn't be able to come to the UK at all, even if that situation persists, because they would be allowed to come to ports and airports in Britain, but would have to quarantine on arrival for 14 days. Now, in terms of whether that may change in the not-too-distant future, there would be a reasonable chance, you would have to assume, because one of the main thresholds on which the UK government makes these decisions is the prevalence in countries from which people are coming. The threshold at the moment that it changes in either direction, its restrictions, is 20 cases per 100,000 of population on a 7-day rolling average. Well, South Africa at this point, on that basis, is at around 18. So there's other data that goes into the mix as well, but the UK government, you would assume, is looking at South Africa as a potential to be added to the list of exemption from quarantine on arrival.
So it's very much a numbers game. Simon, what's the situation in the USA? I know that Donald Trump closed the borders. Has he reopened them? Are international tourists allowed in, or is it depending on which state you want to travel to?
I've got to say, Sally, listening to Olly, I feel as though I'm not just on the other side of an ocean from him. I feel as though I'm in a different universe. This country now has had over 6 million cases of COVID-19. We are closing in on 200,000 deaths. There is absolutely no prospect whatsoever of travel restrictions here altering any time soon. And it's not a question, really, of the travel restrictions that the Trump administration has imposed on people wanting to come in. It's also a question of the travel restrictions that other countries have now imposed on people here in the United States. I can't even go from Washington, D.C. today to Canada, and there's no prospect of that border being reopened by the Canadians anytime soon, because they don't want all sorts of Americans and people living in the United States with the potential risk of COVID-19 infections traveling just across that border. The reality is, if you're a South African and you either have an American passport or you have a green card, that's a permanent resident card, that's the thing I've got that allows me to live here, then yes, you can still travel to the United States and you will be allowed in at the airport, and you won't be forced to go into any kind of quarantine. But unless you have those two documents, an American passport or a green card, this country remains absolutely off limits to you. And honestly, why would you want to be here under the current state with the extent of COVID-19 infections here? There's no change in sight for that this year at all.
Yeah, that's disheartening, but very, very true. Now, Olly, back to you. You were explaining the cases per 100,000, and you're saying South Africa actually at the moment is under that limit. So theoretically, we might get onto the list. But we've also seen a lot of up and down with UK citizens travelling over to Spain and travelling over to France, and they're having to rush back to avoid quarantine. So it's not a straight line, is it? It keeps changing. What has Britain learned that perhaps South Africa can learn from in this situation?
It does keep changing, and I think one of the things that travellers in the UK have learned is that you really, if you do travel, have to be prepared for disruption to be thrown into the mix if the data changes quickly in one direction or another. And I think travellers here in the UK are getting used to that now. We're getting towards the end of the British summer. You have to go abroad with your eyes open and know that the situation may change, and that when you return to the UK, the British traveller may have to quarantine for 14 days if the rules have changed while they've been abroad. I mean, I think addressing that point of Simon's as well about America, the why would you want to be here point, is that we're keeping a very close eye on the direction of travel of the outbreak now here in Britain, with 3,000 more cases again confirmed today, ticking up in terms of the trend. Hospitalisations and deaths remain low, but the government warning that they may well get higher as well. If you look at parts of the northeast of England which have been put under extra restrictions today in terms of social distancing, in Sunderland, for example, cases are up over 100 per 100,000. So South Africans wanting to come to the UK may well have to start considering all of that as well in the not too distant future.
And very quickly from you, Simon, I mean, America has perhaps been a textbook case in how not to handle subsequent waves of this infection, and it's something we in South Africa simply cannot afford, our president said to us last night. How is the US doing at the moment? Is there light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, not if you listen to the public health officials. There isn't. The only person who thinks there's light at the end of the tunnel is President Trump. He keeps saying that the country is rounding the corner. But the most respected public health officials here, including yesterday the head of his own Centres for Disease Control, firmly believe that winter is going to bring a very hefty second wave here, and that even if a vaccine were to be available by the end of this year, it would not have been produced in sufficient quantities to be made available to the general public until the later stages of 2021. So, I mean, there is very little feeling with regard to travel here of any hope, and for all sorts of people in the United States who enjoy travelling internationally, and of course people internationally who love coming to the United States and exploring America, whether as a holiday destination, a business destination, a place where perhaps they've got family members living, I think we're in for many more months of not being able to see one another, and that is very tough on the people involved, but of course it also has massive economic consequences. President Trump says the country can't afford to shut down again. Joe Biden, if he becomes president, may well find himself facing calls to close things down and try finally to come to grips with this on a national level.
Thank you so much, Simon Marks in Washington, D.C., Olly Barratt in London.